Elvis Presley never spoke publicly about the promise. It wasn't written down. It wasn't dramatic. And it certainly wasn't meant for the world to hear. It was made quietly between a son and his mother, long before fame, before Las Vegas lights, before the way to becoming Elvis Presley. But on one specific night, years later, Elvis sat alone and realized something devastating. He had broken it, not on purpose, not out of cruelty, but because life had pulled him further than he ever meant to go. Stay with us until the end, because this story reveals a moment when Elvis wasn't thinking about music, fame, or legacy, only about the one person he never wanted to disappoint. The promise was simple. Too simple to feel dangerous at the time. Elvis had been sitting at the small kitchen table, the house quiet except for the sound of his mother moving around behind him. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, and the radio played softly. Gospel music, familiar and grounding. Gladys Presley stood across from him, watching the way her son stared at nothing while his hands fidgeted with the edge of the table. "You don't gotta go so far," she said gently. Elvis looked up. "I know, Mama." She didn't argue. She rarely did. Instead, she dried her hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, studying him with that look that mothers use when they already know the answer but hope they're wrong. "I just don't want you losing yourself," she said. Elvis smiled, the confident smile of a young man who believed distance couldn't change who he was. "I won't," he said quickly. "I promise." Gladys walked closer and placed her hand over his. "Promise me you'll always come back," she said. "No matter how big it gets. No matter who you become." Elvis didn't hesitate. "I promise," he said. "I'll always come back." At the time, it felt easy, because Elvis thought coming back meant geography. A house. A place. He didn't yet understand that sometimes you leave things without ever physically walking away. Years passed. Success arrived faster than anyone expected. Records sold. Crowds grew. Schedules filled. Elvis's life became measured in miles, hotel rooms, and expectations. And slowly, without noticing, the definition of coming back changed. It wasn't that Elvis stopped calling. It wasn't that he forgot. It was that every time he meant to slow down, something else demanded him. A show, a meeting, a commitment made for him before he'd even been asked. Gladys still wrote letters. Short ones. Warm ones. Always ending the same way. "Come home when you can." Elvis always meant to. That was the problem, because meaning doesn't stop time. And one night, much later, Elvis sat alone, holding one of those letters, and finally understood something that made his chest tighten. He had kept the words of the promise, but lost the meaning, and that realization would come back to him in a way he never expected. Elvis didn't notice the distance at first. It arrived quietly, without announcement, disguised as momentum. One tour bled into the next. One recording session turned into another late night. Every time he looked up, something new needed him, urgently, insistently, and every time he told himself he would slow down after this one last thing, after this show, after this deal, after this city. Gladys's letters kept coming. They were never long. She didn't complain. She didn't accuse. She wrote the way she always had, careful not to burden him, careful not to sound like she was asking for more than he could give. She wrote about the weather, about neighbors, about church, and always, at the end, that same quiet sentence, "Come home when you can." Elvis read those words in hotel rooms that all looked the same. Beige walls, heavy curtains, silence that didn't feel like rest. He would sit on the edge of the bed, letter in hand, and tell himself the same thing every time. Soon became a habit. When Gladys called, Elvis tried to sound cheerful. He talked fast, filled the space with stories about crowds and applause, convinced that if she heard how well things were going, she wouldn't worry. But mothers hear the pauses. "You sound tired," she said once. "I'm fine, Mama," Elvis replied too quickly. There was a moment of silence on the line. "Just remember who you are," she said softly. Elvis smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "I ain't forgot." But something about the way she said it stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. As time passed, the calls became shorter. Not because either of them wanted that, but because time kept stealing pieces of them both. Schedules, flights, obligations. Distance didn't ask permission. It simply took space wherever it found room. One afternoon, Elvis received a call from home. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just an update. Gladys hadn't been feeling well. She was tired more often. Doctors said it was probably stress. Elvis nodded as if she could see him. "I'll come down soon," he said. He meant it. But that night, another commitment appeared. Then another, and then the moment passed, quietly filed away under things to handle later. Elvis told himself he still had time. That was the lie distance tells best, because it never announces itself as loss. It arrives pretending to be patience. The call came early in the morning. Too early. Elvis had barely slept, the kind of restless night where your body lies still, but your mind keeps pacing. The phone rang once, then again, sharp against the quiet of the room. He knew, before answering, that this wasn't a routine update. He picked up the receiver. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was careful, measured, the kind of voice people use when they're trying not to panic the person they're calling. Elvis, it's gotten worse. He sat up slowly, feet touching the cold floor. "How bad?" he asked. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. They've admitted her to the hospital. For a moment, Elvis couldn't speak. He pressed his free hand against his thigh, grounding himself, trying to stay in control of a situation that suddenly felt too fragile to touch. "I'll come now," he said. "I'll get on the next plane." Another pause. Longer this time. "Elvis, they don't think travel right now is a good idea." "She's resting." "Weak." "Weak." The word landed heavier than it should have. "I'll be there," Elvis repeated more firmly, as if volume could bend reality. When the call ended, he sat there staring at the wall, replaying every time he'd said soon. Every letter folded and placed aside. Every call shortened because someone was waiting on the other end. He dressed quickly, movement stiff, automatic. He called his manager, his schedule, his people. "I need to go home," he said. Silence followed. Not refusal, calculation. There were commitments, contracts, expectations already in motion. Canceling wasn't impossible, but it wasn't simple either. Elvis listened jaw tight until the words blurred together. "I'm her son," he said finally. That ended the discussion. The flight felt endless, not because of the distance, but because of the thoughts he couldn't quiet. He remembered the kitchen table, the coffee smell, his mother's hand over his. "Promise me you'll always come back." He had, just not when it mattered most. At the hospital, the smell hit him first, antiseptic, sharp and unforgiving. He moved through the halls like someone who didn't quite belong there, larger than the space allowed, suddenly aware that fame meant nothing in a place built around fragility. Gladys looked smaller than he remembered. Her eyes opened when he entered the room. They softened instantly, even through exhaustion. "Elvis," she said, barely above a whisper. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hand carefully, afraid to squeeze too hard. "I'm here, Mama," he said. She smiled faintly. "I know." That was what broke him. Not anger, not accusation. Acceptance. She didn't ask why it had taken so long. She didn't remind him of anything. She simply looked relieved that he'd come at all. And in that quiet moment, Elvis understood something with painful clarity. The promise hadn't been broken all at once. It had been worn thin, slowly, gently, by time he kept assuming he still had. Elvis stayed. He canceled what he could, delayed what he couldn't. For the first time in years, the world outside the hospital room faded into something distant and unimportant. But even as he sat beside his mother's bed, holding her hand, he felt the quiet truth settling in. Being there now didn't rewrite the nights he hadn't been. Gladys slept often. When she was awake, she spoke softly, carefully, as if she didn't want to tire him. That alone hurt more than any accusation could have. "You don't got to sit here all day," she said once, eyes half closed. "You got things to do." Elvis shook his head. "I ain't go anywhere." She smiled, the same small smile she'd always used when she didn't quite believe him. Not because she doubted his love, but because she understood his life. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, the machines measuring moments that used to pass unnoticed. He listened to the hallway sounds, footsteps, distant voices, the ordinary rhythm of other people's emergencies, and wondered how many times she sat alone while his life roared somewhere else. At night, when the room grew quiet, Elvis replayed memories he hadn't visited in years. Her voice calling him in for dinner, the way she'd worry when he came home late, the pride she tried to hide when his name started appearing on records. She had always known who he was becoming. She had just hoped it wouldn't cost as much. One evening, she stirred and looked at him more intently than she had all day. "You still remember what you promised me?" she asked. Elvis swallowed. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She nodded. "I knew you would." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to, because in that moment, Elvis realized the promise had never been about distance or schedules or success. It had been about presence, about choosing to return not just in body, but in attention, in time, in care. And no matter how long he stayed now, there were moments he could never give back. That understanding sat heavy in his chest, unmovable. Elvis held her hand a little tighter, afraid that loosening his grip might mean losing the moment entirely. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of being alone. He was afraid of leaving again. Night settled into the hospital like a weight. The lights dimmed. The halls grew quieter. Machines continued their steady work, indifferent to the emotions wrapped around them. Elvis sat alone beside his mother's bed, the chair pulled close, his body leaning forward as if proximity alone could keep her there. Gladys slept, her breathing shallow but steady, her face relaxed in a way that felt temporary, borrowed time. He watched her the way you watch something fragile, when you're afraid to blink. This was the night regret finally stopped whispering. It spoke clearly. Elvis thought about every decision he defended over the years. Every time he'd told himself that success was temporary pressure, that things would calm down later, that there would be time to make it right. He realized now how often later had been a shield, a way to avoid choosing. He remembered moments that seemed small then, a missed call, a postponed visit, a letter answered late. None of them felt like betrayal at the time. Together, they had become one. Elvis lowered his head, resting his forehead against his knuckles, careful not to make a sound. This wasn't the kind of pain that demanded tears. It was quieter than that, deeper. "I tried," he whispered, not sure who he was speaking to. "Tried to be everything. Tried to make everyone proud. Tried to carry a life that kept getting heavier the higher it climbed. But trying hadn't kept the promise intact. Being present would have." Gladys stirred slightly, her fingers tightening weakly around his hand. Elvis looked up instantly. Her eyes opened halfway. "You okay?" she asked. The question landed like a blow. Here she was, weak, exhausted, still worried about him. Elvis forced a small smile. "Yeah, Mama, I'm okay." She studied his face longer than before, as if memorizing it. "You always been a good boy," she said softly, "even when you've been gone." The words should have comforted him. Instead, they broke something open, because they carried forgiveness he hadn't earned. Elvis felt his throat tighten. "I should have been here more." Gladys didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was barely there. "You came back," she said. "That's what matters." But Elvis knew the truth hiding between the lines. Coming back late still meant leaving early. As the night stretched on, Elvis stayed awake, listening to the machines, the distant footsteps, the breathing beside him. He made a quiet decision then, not about his career, not about schedules, about awareness. If he couldn't undo the regret, he would stop ignoring it, because regret, he realized, wasn't punishment. It was instruction. Morning came quietly, not with urgency, not with alarms. Just light slipping through the thin hospital curtains, touching the edge of the bed where Gladys lay resting. Fragile, smaller than the woman Elvis carried his memory. Elvis hadn't slept. He didn't feel tired. He felt awake in a way he hadn't been in years. Sometime before sunrise, Gladys stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then settling on him with recognition that felt almost instinctive. "You stayed," she said. Elvis nodded. I ain't going anywhere. She smiled faintly. Not the smile of relief, the smile of understanding. For the first time, Elvis realized something that landed gently but permanently inside him. The promise had never been about always coming back. It had been about not drifting so far away that coming back required permission from time. He squeezed her hand softly. I thought keeping busy was taking care of things, Elvis said quietly. I thought Providence was enough. Gladys didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely more than breath. You did your best, she said, but don't let the world take all of you. That was a promise. Not geography, not schedules. Presence, awareness, choice. Later that day, when Doctor spoke in careful language and avoided his eyes, Elvis already knew. You learn to recognize inevitability when it stops feeling sharp and starts feeling still. He stayed until the end. When it came, it was quiet. No drama. No final words meant for history. Just a moment where holding on turned into letting go. Elvis didn't cry right away. He sat there unmoving, as if standing up might break the last thread connecting him to who he'd been before that moment. In the days that followed, people would speak about strength, about resilience, about how Elvis Presley kept going. And he did, but something inside him shifted forever. From that night on, Elvis measured things differently. Not by success, not by applause, but by absence. He learned to notice when he was leaving parts of himself behind, when promises became habits instead of intentions, when love asked for presence instead of performance. The promise followed him for the rest of his life, not as guilt, as awareness. And in quiet moments, when the noise faded and the lights went down, Elvis would remember the kitchen table, the coffee smell, the simple words spoken too easily. I promise I'll always come back. Now he understood what that had truly meant.